Blizzard followed the Wrath of the Lich King with the Cataclysm expansion in 2010. Cataclysm was where Blizzard writ large their idea of remaking old world content like we saw with the Naxxramas raid in Wrath, but instead of just a raid, this time Blizzard were far more ambitious and instead remade many of the old world zones. Cataclysm included 9 dungeons with 45 raid bosses within them, the same number of dungeon bosses as Wrath, but in, again, slightly fewer dungeons. This was the same design and development shortcut at work that Blizzard made in Wrath, but dialed it up a notch in Cataclysm. The average number of bosses per dungeon was 3 in the Burning Crusade, then 4 in Wrath of the Lich King, and now 5 in Cataclysm. However, the dungeon hub Scarlet Monastery sort of model where Blizzard would make 3 or 4 dungeons together in one location, which was prevalent throughout all of the Burning Crusade and dwindled a little bit in Wrath, was effectively finished in Cataclysm. Cataclysm dungeons were all uniformly larger than in previous expansions, with 5, 6, or in one case even 7 bosses in a dungeon, and they were all standalone instances rather than the hubs of 3 or 4. Continuing on from the reusing content theme with Naxxramas in Wrath, in Cataclysm, Blizzard brought back the Zul'Gurub raid from vanilla, but transformed it into a dungeon for Cataclysm. So while releasing Nax had been a large shortcut to a large amount of raid content released very cheaply or somewhat easily for Blizzard in Wrath, ZG being reused as a dungeon in Cataclysm made for a much smaller shortcut to a much smaller set of content, if that makes sense. Reusing older content in Cataclysm didn't have the same sort of payoff as it had in the past. So while Cataclysm did manage to hold on to the sort of standard of 45 or so dungeon bosses that both the Burning Crusade and Wrath had set, it fell to far fewer total number of raid bosses released, because Blizzard didn't opt to recycle an old raid. Cataclysm included only 27 raid bosses in the whole expansion, which would have been similar to what Wrath would have had at 30 if Naxxramas wasn't reused. On paper, for dungeons and raids in particular, Cataclysm was the second smallest expansion that Blizzard has ever released, by total dungeon and raid bosses at least. It had more dungeons than other expansions, well, at least more dungeons than Warlords of Draenor, but it had 1 fewer raid boss than Warlords of Draenor. What isn't in the scope of this video is where Cataclysm excelled. It wasn't really a dungeon and raid expansion, at least in my opinion, in the same way that, let's say, Wrath, Burning Crusade, Legion, Mists of Pandaria, a lot of other expansions were. So I'm going to editorialize a little bit here and say that Cataclysm did 3 important things, good things. The first was remaking old open world zones. The common sentiment at the time was that expansions felt too compartmentalized. Each expansion prior to Cataclysm was its own self-contained continent with its own capital city where players hung out all the time, and that made a lot of the rest of the world feel forgotten and empty. Cataclysm alleviated that by taking players back to Kalimdor and the Eastern Kingdoms. Second, it made dungeons hard again, especially at the beginning of the expansion where they were most relevant for gear and progression. I'm sure a lot of you remember Stonecore and the Throne of Tides and Blackrock Caverns and Halls of Origination and Vortex Pinnacle and a lot of the Cataclysm raids that people often fondly look back on as being very difficult but also very fun content. Dungeons were just difficult in Cataclysm in ways that they weren't in the Burning Crusade and Wrath. I might be reading between the lines a little bit too much here, but I think Blizzard were getting players ready and testing content difficulty for what was about to come in the next expansion. And third and finally, Cataclysm introduced what we would now call, or I guess think of as, rotations and priorities and economies for specs and classes. The groundwork for many of the concepts, the combat focused concepts that we would take for granted today, or at least think of as being baseline parts of the game and specializations, such as offensive cooldowns, priority spells, rotations, fillers, spenders, resource economies. Those were all laid down in Cataclysm and then somewhat perfected in what was to come, the Mists of Pandaria expansion. But that discussion is for the next video. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching, and algorithm stuff.